we need to do to burn that into your all's brains for the next
Yeah, I
time?
think we need to write a little instruction card
Right,
for
we'll
ourselves.
do that later.
And put it in
Well,
the box.
Okay, here we are on April 24th, I believe. Is that right? 24th,
Yes.
we believe it is. 2013. I'm Jane Woodrow, a member of the Oral History Project Committee, and I'm interviewing Frances Strickland, who's a distinguished member of the association and has been involved with us for quite some time, and is also the wife of our former governor, Ted Strickland. And Frances, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about how you became a psychologist and why?
Well, I became a psychologist because I was interested in children's learning problems. I'd been working with, I was a teacher for a couple of years, and then I became interested while I was teaching in those kids who were missing class because they were behind the curtains in the gym or in the bathroom. And it was pretty easy to have conversations with them, and I decided that I wanted to know a little bit more about working with them, so I went to the University of Colorado and got a degree in guidance and counseling. But while I was getting the degree, I saw that basically what you did with that was help kids get into classes they wanted or get into college, and I wanted to save souls.
Mm-hmm.
So when I came back, I got a job with the Department of Children's Services in Kentucky and ended up in a program that had services for adjudicated delinquents, residential care. And they gave me the youngest kids, the youngest girls who were 13 and 14, 12, 13 and 14, and the youngest boys who were 8 and 9. And I found that those kids were in trouble primarily because of what they were doing while they were truant from school. So then I wanted to know why they were truant from school, and I went to the schoolhouse on the premises and found that they had these huge lags in their learning and where they were expected to be performing. So then that made me want to go back to college. So then I went to get my PhD in educational psychology. So that's how I got into it.
Okay. And so when did you get your degree, finally?
In 1980.
1980.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you were still living in Kentucky at that time?
I say 80, was it 76? Ted's was in 80 and mine was at 76.
Aha!
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what, I got the two mixed up.
Okay. So, but you were living in Kentucky
Kentucky.
at that time, and were you and Ted married at that point?
No,
or
we didn't get married until 1987.
Okay. All right. And so there you were in Kentucky with your degree, and how did you get to Ohio? How did
I married Ohio.
you married Ohio? Okay. So you married Ted, and he swept you off your feet.
And he swept me over the state line.
Swept you over the state line. Okay, great. And what did you do once you got over the state lines?
I worked on a provisional license with the Board of Education in Scioto County, and became pretty disturbed with the way they were using the assessment data. In Kentucky, I'd been on a state panel for learning disabilities, and we were really trying to come up with the best ways to figure out what kids need without labeling them any more than we had to. And in Scioto County, it felt like they were the labels really helped them get additional funding for their classes and stuff. And so the way they were interpreting test scores really bothered me a lot. So I talked to the superintendent. In fact, at one point there was a suggestion that maybe I would want to change or go back and look at some of the scoring I did, because maybe I made a mistake and a child should have really been over here instead of over here. So I told him that I was really troubled about some of the standards, and it was the way the state had written up the guidelines. Basically, if you had a 79, you were EMH. If you had an 80, you were LD.
Right.
And so, we just didn't do things like that in Kentucky. There had to be a trend, there had to be a lot more evidence than that one point.
Right.
And I had a person that had been 78, who then for me came out to be 81. So they wanted
Because
me
there is
to
a
look at my scoring.
variation. Yeah, you expect a variation. You don't expect to get exactly the same
Yeah.
score. Okay.
So he said I either had to just live with it or come to the state level and make complaints. And Ted was getting into politics, and I thought, I'm just not going to do that. So I just left the field. I just left that. And I got back in it when he got into Congress, and then I would go back down to Kentucky and live with my folks and work down in that system rather than the Ohio system.
Okay, so how did you get involved then with OPA? Because you eventually did become involved with our organization.
Right.
So.
Well, Ted and John Corrigan were good friends. John kind of liked the idea of I had been in Ohio very long, and I came from another state, another perspective, and I think there was kind of a freshness of view that he thought I could bring in, so he asked me to serve on the board.
Okay. And what did you do while you were on the board?
Well, I would come to meetings and lend my thoughts. John was trying to, he was a planner, he was kind of a visionary, he was trying to lay out what he could see for the next 5 years. But then, wasn't too long, and I didn't get the timeline. I should have gone back through some of my files and things, but I figured you all have them and you can fill this in. But we started having problems with staff, and staff was complaining to John about the fact that they couldn't work with the executive director then, and we were having too much turnover. So then John felt compelled to form a committee to look into it and come back with recommendations.
How much staff was there at that time?
Seems to me there were 3 people.
Including or besides the executive director?
Besides the executive director.
Okay.
I think there were 3. Again, I think y'all can verify.
Right,
But
your
when you have
recollection
almost
is-
like 100% being dissatisfied, and it was like micromanaging and so John asked me to head up that committee, and we understood at the time it would be a very unpopular thing to do, and that I should not have any ideas of having a major leadership in the role. It's in the OPA that once you do something like that, that's the way you'll always be remembered, and we figured it was going to be divisive.
And that you would not be able to continue in a leadership role
Right.
in OPA after that.
Well, maybe
I see.
OPA, and maybe I could be on the board, but I couldn't be in a leadership board, and so that was fine. I was willing to do that. And I wish I could think of the members of the committee. It seems to me there were like 5 or 6 of us, and it was. We didn't want to get into he said, she said type of thing. So what we did was to just study organizations and how they evolve over time and how their needs change. And as the need changes, then the leadership needs to change to fit the needs. And what we figured out was in the developing phase, there's a startup, and then you've got what you have to do to start becoming more stable, and then you have to get to a point where you have to renew yourself, and you've got to be able to have growth going on. So we concluded that the executive director was really good on the startup because he had all of the various talents that you needed to do about every aspect. And that was what was causing the problems with the staff. He was micromanaging because he knew how to do them all himself, and so he was constantly over their shoulders, and I can't remember all the details, but it created a morale problem. Let's just leave it at that. So the committee then, I guess like as psychologists do, we just went through this whole pattern thing, and we wrote up a report and talked about how we had gone through, when you've got problems with leadership, you can ratchet up. In other words, you can become more intense and try to be more demanding, or you can patch and try to add on and work around. And we were trying to do part-time things to patch and work around the executive director, and we determined we just didn't have the money to keep doing that. There's a book now I've read recently called A Failure of Nerve, and that's what we were faced with. We all knew what we needed to do, and it was going to boil down to whether or not we had the nerve to do it. And we had been putting it off for some time. So John had the resolve.
When you say some time, years, months?
Well, I don't know, because I was new to it.
Okay.
But people pretty readily could recognize the problem. And very few people that I talked to seemed totally shocked that there was this kind of problem. So it just hadn't come to a head with all the staff coming together at one point like that. And then John, maybe he was the kind of leader that was willing to deal with it too. And the subsequent president after him had to also deal with it, and she was able to pick it up too. Well, one of the most interesting times in my professional career was that final meeting when we had to get the vote from the full board about whether or not to go forward with this change that we needed in leadership. And I laid it all out about the organizational development and personality-wise and leadership style-wise and so forth, why we needed a different leader for where we were. And there was all these board members, all these psychologists were very quiet through the whole thing, and I could just feel my face getting red and stuff because it was not a pleasant thing to have to do. And there were like 3 or 4 very strong people who were kind of shaming us for even raising a question after somebody had sacrificed as much as he had. And so I would come back and say, it's not anything personal, it's organizational development and leadership style and all that. So yes, we appreciate all these things, it's just we've got to look at where we are. And when it came time for the vote, all these people all these psychologists that had sat there and not said anything through the whole thing, just quietly raised their hand in support of the report. And the other 4, voted against it. But it was probably the only time in my life I've seen a group of people just take quiet counsel within themselves, not get in the crossfire or anything, and to just simply quietly, unobtrusively vote.
They just voted. There wasn't a lot of discussion about it.
No,
the report had been laid out so clearly.
I think
perhaps
that was added, but it could have been the kind of professionals you all are.
Also, nobody wanted to speak against the executive director, who you have not mentioned the name yet, and I think we have to say
Henry
that.
Saban.
Right.
Yeah,
And
tremendously talented guy.
He really was very talented and had sort of started the organization from scratch, almost on his own. And I forgot how many years he directed the association.
Well, that was
But
it. I mean, he's been there
considerable.
so many years. I don't know, like
Yeah.
15, 16
Mm-hmm.
plus. And it was a terribly difficult thing. And again,
Right.
it kind of fell into perspective when I read the Failure of Nerve book.
Mhm.
I mean, it's to say organizations really make a mistake when they recognize there's a problem and then they try to do anything but deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And we were beginning to do other things to work around it rather than deal with it.
Right.
And now John had to hold steady too. I mean, it's one thing that we had to report, but then you had to have a strong president. And I remember in one meeting where Henry was there, and it was a board meeting, and he just told John that things were a particular way, and John had to say to him, "No, they're not." And that took a lot of courage and nerve. I mean, you know, those are moments where everything's just quiet. I mean, you hardly even want to breathe because it's just so difficult and tough. But I think it's probably a credit to our profession that we were able to deal with it with as little damage as we did. I mean, the feelings. I don't think Henry ever forgave me, and I don't think the people that were really strongly for him probably did either. But we understood that. I mean, that was it. To understand that going into it was part of the maturity of our profession, I thought. So that was really a very interesting
Right.
time.
And so that committee was about 5 people, you think?
I think that's right.
Yeah, and
I remember
some-
Carol was on it, and I think it was Carol, and
Carol.
Johnson,
Oh, okay.
and David Velkamp, or Hellkamp. There was 2 of them, but I can't remember. Stephanie might have been on it
Uh-huh.
because she was the next president.
Okay. Did you mention Sandy Schulman? Was she on that?
I don't believe she was.
She,
But
okay.
when we would bring it to the full board, she understood organizations,
I see.
that she could recognize what we were
What you were
looking at
talking about.
and
Okay.
help put it into even better words. I didn't have an study of organizations background like she did, and so she was able to
I
really
see.
bring a lot of clarity to and answer questions. And she also asked a lot of good questions that kind of guided us toward what we would be looking into as well.
Okay. Okay, so did you just disappear from the board after that? Or did you stay on for a while?
I stayed on, I can't remember when I went off. I was on during Stephanie's term, I
Okay.
believe. And then maybe I went off when Ted got into politics. Maybe I felt like I couldn't be on. But I remember at some point taking over the foundation, the fundraising,
Political Action Committee.
and I wasn't on the board then, was I? So
But,
Ted would have
but
been.
you were on a political action committee. Is that what you're saying?
Well, he got into running for Congress in '92.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
And so that would have given me John's term and Stephanie's term. Did they have 2 year? Were they 1 year terms?
I think they were just 1-year terms, actually. Although there's 3-year involvement. You're a, pre-president,
Yeah.
president, and then
Yeah.
post-presidential year. So the executive committee involvement extends for 3 years.
Yeah.
for
I
each
just
of the-
remember those 2, and then but I can't remember how I got approached about doing the fundraising piece of it.
That was before Ted ran for governor. Was
But after
like
he had
2
been on the
years, 2 years
Congress.
before he ran for governor, I believe.
So
Because
you
then you resigned as he was beginning to run for governor.
The other person speaking here, who is not on camera, is Bobby Celeste,
Yeah.
who is currently our, what is your title?
Director of Professional Affairs.
Affairs.
So he ran for Congress, for the governor in 2005, I believe.
So it would have been probably 202, 203, 204, around there.
Mm-hmm. Was doing that. So I don't know what the gap was in between there. So, but I did start working back in Kentucky when Ted was in '92. He lost in '94, and then he got back in '96. So from '96 to 2002, I would be going. I was on alternating years. I was taking contracts down in Kentucky to work in the school system. So maybe that was part of it too. I would work the year he didn't have to run, and then I would be off the year. I was doing contract work, so I could kind of call the shots on that.
So that was handy.
It was handy, and I knew I was missing the profession because I was with Ted at a political dinner. I remember it was in Benton County, and I was sitting by a woman, or Hocking County, and a woman was talking about her child's learning problems in school. And on the way home, Ted said, we always compared notes to see if I picked up anything that would be helpful. And I told him it was one of the best dinners I'd ever been to. And he said, what happened? I said, I sat by this woman. We diagnosed her child's learning problems the whole time. So, didn't help him any, but it let me know that I still had a deep passion for that. So when he got back in, then instead of working with him in his field, then I just called my old boss to see if there was any way of being helpful. And a woman was going on a sabbatical, so I took her year, and that's how I got started back in.
And I have a memory, Frances, of you coming to an OWP meeting once and playing the guitar, and we were singing and playing the guitar.
Oh yeah,
Do you remember that?
I do.
I don't remember when that was, but
well, it was a convention or something.
yeah, at a convention.
And we were in
the
some
Ohio
little-
Women in Psychology would have, at that time, would have a dinner one of the nights, and
So then we went in, and I remember Steve Swartz was that his last name. Steve was his first name. His last name was something like Swartz. Could play a whole lot better than I could.
oh,
So he ended up with the guitar. And I can't think of the woman, but there was a woman, a psychologist there, she's still very much involved, who knew every song you could come up with and all the words. It was really, and the most fun thing was she and Steve got to singing Wild Thing together. And so with time, all those talents and the surprises, I didn't know Steve could play, I didn't know she knew all those songs. That was really, really fun.
right. Well, that is an interesting thing about psychologists and physicians
We're not all
too.
stodgy.
We there are often other skills that people have that
Yeah,
they develop as well. I think it keeps you sane.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you have any other interesting observations you'd like to make before we wrap up the interview about psychology in Ohio and the development of our association and things like that?
Well, after Ted got into the governor thing, I pretty much got so tied up in that world again that I kind of lost track of, other than reading the journals, what all the issues were. But I do think that it's so important that fields like psychology make sure that they don't lose their voice, because it seems like to me, and maybe this is a psychologist's perspective, that we've got this debate going on in this country between the individualists who believe they're where they are because of all of the sacrifices they made, and those of us that know there by the grace of God go I. And psychologists understand probably both views very well, and now we've gotten into this whole thing about winning, and each side wants to win, and so they're not listening to each other. And I think psychology probably has to understand and does understand that it takes both kinds. I mean, you've got to have the people that understand that there is such a thing as individual responsibility,
Right.
as well as those who understand some have a whole lot easier access to it than others. And in the name of fairness, we have to try to open up more of those opportunities. And it's a both and psychology, because I guess we have to keep this kind of openness with people that come in and talk to us, where we try to get in their shoes and understand what they're feeling and thinking, that can try to help bridge those communication gaps. But I'm really concerned about what's happening in education and where we are on achievement test scores, for example, and competition. And we know in psychology those things aren't helpful to kids. And yet I don't hear the voice of school psychologists or educational psychologists much at all in the media or popular.
That's true. Maybe we need to get on our school psychology colleagues and get them.
Well, I know that, but here's part of the problem is that, so you don't want to be so sensationalized that people are afraid to come to you, because, and so once you jump into the public stream, it can really hurt your ability to be as low key as you need to be in order to be trusted as a professional psychologist. So that's the same principle about once I took on that role of heading up that committee, it shut some things off for me from then on. And so psychologists have to understand really carefully. But that's one of the things I liked about, as a group or as a profession, when the whole group would come out against something. So I've been wondering where the school psychologists or the educational psychologists have been on this. I mean, we know better than anybody the silliness of basing so much on these scores.
Right.
And not a peep out of us. It's I mean, maybe it's there, but that's one of the things I know, having been involved in politics. It's what gets to the public view that really matters, and much of what we think, if we think much about it, it's not making it to the public view.
Well, the school psychologists have their own association, which is separate from OPA, and I'm not aware of them having an advocacy arm. I don't know.
They have one person who will be at the State House for them, but they don't have as many resources, or not as many of them.
Right. It's not as
So
large group.
We ask, where's the outrage? And the outrage should be from those of us who know the impact of these things on the human condition. Nobody knows that better than psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists. And yet, somehow or another, the Tea Party rhetoric and the tough people shouldn't have because they're undeserving. If they didn't take care of it themselves, then they should do without. They seem to be having so much stronger voice than the.
Well, it's so simple.
Yeah.
As Sandy Shulman was often want to say, well, it's more complicated than that.
Yeah. Well, and that's it. I was reading about the uncertainty principle, and I was thinking, well, that captures it. They are so certain, and we know that it's
more complicated
because people are wired up differently, situations are different, and so you can't even work with one client in the same way you would work with another, because even if it's the same problem, because we understand the differences so much, but they don't. They are more concentrated on a solution that they think will work for everybody, and we know that there have to be a lot of different, again, the complicated thing. But we're getting too much stress and too many things again that we know are there when you have an unhealthy environment going on. There's too much of that now going on, and so those of us that understand have got to figure out how to find our voices, which is where Bobby and I were working together on this Fairness Coalition, trying to figure out how those of us who are really concerned about the human condition can find our voices. But I think it's going to have to be a collective voice. I don't think individual voices can stand up. I mean, guys, look at
Right.
the gun control thing.
Right.
I mean, even with 90% of the people, we still weren't able to get that passed. So there's a lot to try to understand. Even if we used our profession to help us understand it,
To
then
change it is
then
another matter.
start trying to help us figure out ways to move. I was just meeting with a couple of people who are wanting to do, Bobby, what you and I were doing, or what we started doing. And they want to go around and find out what people really believe about stuff, their values and all that. And it reminded me of the whole thing about testing, where they said we are more concerned about having a good test than we are dealing with the results and doing something good with the results. So we spend all of our time trying to figure out what we think, to where we never then get to the stage of doing anything with it. So I handed them all of our work. I said, here's 2 years worth of work, and you can go around and you probably are going to end up with a lot of comments that you got to synthesize that'll bring you back to these 3 things. And then you got to figure out what you're going to do with it, just like it's where we got on it. So I just wish I could see more psychologists at community meetings and things, or even calling them sometimes. But again, there is the part about what kind, how much in the public eye they can be and still be the professional that they need to be. So I'm sure you all have talked about that before. I remember when I was on a board, we talked about social justice. Remember that?
Yeah.
I don't know where that got to. Do you?
No, it kind of, I mean, I think it's an ongoing discussion. How much does an association spend time working on political, social justice issues, and how much does it spend working on guild issues to help psychologists? It's an ongoing dialogue.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's maybe Bobby summed it up, where because of the influence of politics, a lot of my thinking goes in that direction, and not the guild direction. So maybe I wouldn't be a very good board member now.
Well, I think we need both. I think
Yes. I think a lot of things require a certain tension between the 2 poles, so that you come out with a really good decision.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that certainly is where the union groups are now, teachers' unions especially. I mean, they've been accused of being so interested in the guild end of things that they've not really been on the other side. So, but I've been going back through sorting things out that I was into in the 80s before Ted got into politics. And we were really asking all those major questions. We were trying to understand the child from the inside out and all that kind of thing. And really, what happened to it? I mean, how does it go away when it was so fruitful? And I think it goes away because policies and the flow of dollars and the path of least resistance causes us to shift away. And so inside of me there's this wish that professionals who really know the research, won't allow the shifts to go like that. But again, it takes a collective voice, and that brings us back to then OPA is a collective voice. So.
Right. Now, are you maintaining your psychology license, or are you moving more into the political sphere? What are you
Well, Ted and I
doing?
both let our license go. We couldn't keep up this.
Right,
Well, he couldn't keep up the CEU units.
right.
And then I thought, well, with where I'd been, didn't figure I'd go back to that world that I'd been in before.
Mm-hmm.
And it, you know, so right now I'm advocating for public education, maintaining public education, as opposed to this trend that I see toward privatizing and commercialization of
Right.
education. I think that would be disastrous, particularly from a public standpoint or democracy standpoint. So I guess that's probably a political thing there. But I'm trying to call on what I know as a professional to put a solid ground
Under that.
under
yeah.
it. And it's really, maybe that's why I want others doing it, because I'm trying to struggle with that myself. If I can't do it myself, then I don't know how others can do it either. So I see myself more as trying to help education at this point than help the field of psychology. But I'm hoping that what I know from psychology will, and that you aren't uncovering, or that the field is uncovering a whole lot of new stuff that's going to make me out of date in what I'm trying to do. That's always the worry. But I see these things holding up over time. And in education, there was this thing about, after we know for sure something works, and it works for the majority, it takes 20 years before it is routinely applied or implemented. So I've got a pretty long period of time here that my knowledge base ought to hold up.
Right. Yes. Patience over time.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Frances. I'm so glad we got to interview you today.
It was,
Okay.
I keep looking at y'all's conferences and thinking, I should say our conferences, and I ought to end up coming back to some, but I do notice that in the schedule a lot it is for practitioners. And so I think, well, you know, I won't really be getting back into that much, so so I haven't been drawn to come to them at this point, I should say.
Right. Well, maybe something really exciting will occur that you'll feel like you need to come to one of them. We'd be glad
Well, I
to
sure
see
like
you.
reading the magazine or the online publication that comes out. So
Good. Yeah, let's keep in touch.
okay, that's good.
Thank you very much.